Hi everyone, this is the class that you are supposed to be watching on Friday, February 19. Just mentioning this so that you keep track of all the recorded lectures. And some of you are probably getting behind. I'm sure all of you, or most of you, I should say, are keeping up with the lectures. Don't forget to read. And the readings, of course, but we'll see. We'll see pretty soon. The midterm is coming in a few weeks, and that's usually a pretty good indicator of where you guys have been all these days. So anyway, let me start sharing my screen so I can pick up where I left last time. So if you remember, we are talking about the debt crisis, stabilization and reforms. And the basic idea that you need to remember for this chapter is that all of this debt situation in Latin America was produced as a result of the implementation of the ISI strategies, the import substitution industrialization in Latin America during the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. In the 1980s, it was clear that the policies were unsustainable, high social cost, and things that we discussed last week. And we arrived into this debt crisis that produced major costs for Latin America. So briefly, if you remember, we talk about four main reasons that accumulated this huge amount of external debt. Actually, this is a good point to explain this. What's the difference between external debt and internal debt? So let me go with internal debt first before I go over these four reasons, because I forgot to mention this last time. So internal debt is the type of debt that is generated by the federal government, where when they issue government financial instruments. So in the case of the US, I'm talking about treasury bills, treasury bonds. So the federal government is selling these instruments to the American public, and effectively the American public is making a loan to the federal government because you are promised to be paid an interest in return. So every country, or most countries around the world that have a more or less developed financial system are able to do that. Let me stop sharing this so I can you can see me. But anyway, the internal debt is produced by this process of selling government financial instruments to domestic citizens. Not necessarily domestic citizens only, but that's the basic idea. So you borrow money from the public, sometimes to finance development projects, sometimes to make up the difference. I'm talking about the fiscal deficit, to pay for a deficit, and so on. So the idea is that we call this internal debt because you are borrowing money from domestic people. Now, external debt, which is the one that we have been talking about in the case of Latin America, is when governments borrow money from the rest of the world, specifically banks, international financial institutions, and also multilateral agencies like the World Bank and the IMF. So that's the basic distinction. Now, this is important because in the case of Latin America, Latin American governments generate internal debt in domestic currency. So Mexico is borrowing from domestic citizens in Mexican pesos. The same in Bolivia, in Argentina, in Nicaragua. So all they need to do if they want to pay back is to print more Mexican pesos, more Venezuelan bolivares, or whatever currency in Latin America they use. Now, external debt is different because you are borrowing money in either dollars or Japanese yens right? Or euros, all of those hard currencies that we have talked about before. Now, Latin America cannot print dollars. Well, I guess they can, counterfeit, $100 bills and things like that, but that's usually not what the government does. The point is that external debt cannot be easily paid because different from internal, where you can print money, with external debt, you actually have to generate the foreign exchange by selling to the rest of the world, exports, putting this in your bucket of balance of payments, and then use that. Remember we talk about this liquid, this thing in your bucket that we call foreign exchange. You take that and then you pay your debt, you buy stuff from the rest of the world, like imports and things like that. So anyway, I just want to make sure that this distinction between internal and external debt, at least the basic notion, was clear to most of you, because what we have been talking about here is external debt, not internal debt. Anyway, so let's see. Let me go back now. All right, now that I hope this differentiation is clear, we briefly summarize the idea of the 4 reasons that fuel the accumulation of this external debt. So the first one we said is this so-called debt trap, which essentially has to do with mismanagement, really. Let me see, I'm talking about this debt trap. So the idea is that the terms of the loan don't match the rate of return timing of the project. And I explained this with a basic example, I believe, where you borrow money for a highway that is going to start producing money, say in 15, 20 years, but you have to pay the money back to your lender in 10. So obviously there is an inconsistency. Either the project should move faster to generate money earlier, or the terms of the loan should be longer, not 10, but perhaps 15 or 20 years, so that you have enough time to generate the capacity to pay it back. And again, when you look back in hindsight, it's like a no-brainer, right? But at the time, remember, many of these banks behave in a very irresponsible way because they have to allocate all these petrodollars. They didn't want to keep these monies, these resources in their vaults. They want to generate loans, more and loans and loans and loans, so that they could start charging interest and making money. So it was a combination of factors that produced this really, really bad situation that obviously produced significant consequences. Anyway, the second reason that we discussed was the economic populist measurements and governments and policies of the time. So we talk about the mismanagement in terms of government policy, because they didn't think about the consequences of inflation, fiscal deficits, and the accumulation of debt. They always thought, oh, we can pay back. Obviously, they discovered that was not the case. And here I made a note about Keynes, the very famous British economist, because many of these economists at the time in Latin America and policymakers in Latin America relied significantly on this Keynesian approach, which basically tells that when the private sector is unable to stimulate the economy, well, the government can take over and drive the economy. But of course, in Latin America, they took this too far and produced significant troubles. The third one is about external shocks. Not everything that went wrong happened within Latin America. There were things happening in the rest of the world that also, didn't help. In particular, and I think I mentioned, briefly that perhaps you could talk to your grandparents to tell you stories about the 1980s when the price of gasoline just went up to the roof, and that produced a major inflationary process in the US and other oil-dependent countries. So inflation was going up in the 1980s, and then Paul Volcker, back then the chairman of the Federal Reserve, decided to increase the interest rates to close to 19%. Now, the idea of increasing interest rates is twofold. You want to reduce consumption, and you want to reduce investment. How do you reduce consumption? Well, because when the interest rate is higher, your incentive to save money increases. Because, okay, think about 19%. You go to the bank and they say, we'll pay you 19% per year. So you put $100 in, and in a year after, you're going to get your $100 plus $19. So it's a very attractive proposition when the interest rate is high. And also, this reduces the incentive to invest. Because if you go to the bank and the bank says, okay, you want a loan of $1 million, I'm going to charge you 25%, you probably say, I think I'm going to skip that one. So the idea of reducing consumption and reducing investment is to put the brakes on the economy to get inflation under control. Anyway, that was happening in the US and other oil-dependent countries because the price of oil and gasoline went really high. And of course, the rest of the world responded in a very similar fashion. Now, the problem for Latin America was that most of this external debt, the terms of this debt implied a variable interest rate rather than a fixed interest rate. So again, I think this should resonate with what happened recently. Most of you probably remember 2007, 2009, the housing crisis, when many mortgages, rather than being tied to a fixed interest rate, they were a variable interest rates, and that produced a major problem. Well, yes, internationally, something similar happened 40 years ago in Latin America. So obviously, when the interest rates go up, paying your monthly payment, if you're thinking about your mortgage or your card, your credit card interest just goes up and up and up, and eventually it becomes very difficult, very challenging to pay. Anyway, that's number 3. And number 4, we said, well, when many people start seeing what's happening, they lose confidence on the government and the policies the government is implementing. And they said, you know what, I'm out. I'm going to cash out. So they sell property and then buy foreign exchange and then make deposits in Europe, in Europe, in the US. So this is the time where, many banks in places like Miami, Texas, and California for Mexicans became a target because they took their money in Mexican pesos out of Mexican banks, change it to American dollars, and deposit in all these monies in the US. Something similar happened in other Latin American countries. The point is that is not good because, entrepreneurs, people with money, resources, lose confidence and they leave the country. And with that, they take a significant tax base. So that means that the government suddenly is losing the ability to generate tax revenue, and that produces the need to print more money, which produces the need to increase inflation, pressuring the exchange rate. It was just a mess. Anyway, I also said that finally in 1982, because of this accumulation of debt, Mexico announces to the international financial community that Mexico cannot pay back. They cannot be, face their financial responsibilities, financial obligations, and that produces a domino effect. So Mexico says, I cannot pay, and then Argentina, Brazil, and many other Latin American countries follow up. I also said that at first this was thought as an illiquidity problem, which basically meant, okay, you guys don't have the money now, but no worries, we'll wait for you until you get the money. Of course, that was a miscalculation because it was not an illiquidity problem. It was an insolvency problem, which meant, okay, you guys don't have the money now. You are not going to have the money anytime in the near future. You are insolvent, right? So that produced a major problem for the banks. And I already, if you have not seen the class, the previous class, you need to see that, because I drew a picture showing the Latin America, the international financial banks, the oil-rich countries depositing petrodollars, and eventually the intervention of the IMF and the World Bank, right? So this is basically where we left. What happened? What's happening here? Well, as I said, the IMF and the World Bank, they talked to Latin American governments and they said, okay, guys, clearly you're in troubles. And because of your ineptitude and because of your inability to generate a sustainable economic development path for Latin America, you are also causing troubles for the international community. These banks, Chase, remember, I have a list here, Chase, Citicorp, Chemical, Wells Fargo, and many other banks around the world. And this is producing a major crisis worldwide, financial instability. We need to do something about it. And that is going to start with you guys in Latin America. You need to change your policies. And this is, again, the beginning of what, people has characterized as this conditionality. Let me do something better than that. Conditionality. The adoption of strict fiscal, monetary, and trade policies in exchange of the release of funds. So what does that mean? Okay. The World Bank and the IMF said, you guys in Latin America need to forget about your dependency theory, import substitution, industrialization policies. They obviously fail because now you're finding yourselves in a really tough situation. You cannot pay us back or pay these banks back, and that produces a major turmoil. You have internal instability, social unrest, inflation. The inflation part was huge. So let me tell you a few stories here. So when they talk about strict fiscal policy, they are talking about you need to reduce the size of the government. That means privatize. You need to sell state-owned enterprises and give them to private entrepreneurs. So forget about your candy factories. No. You may be able to keep government, federal government. You may be able to keep ownership of strategic industries like oil, like electricity, like telecommunications, like water. That's fine. But the many other industries, you need to get rid of them. You need to thin the government. And also you need to reduce regulations. You need to reduce taxes, especially corporate taxes, because you need to stimulate the private enterprise, private markets, all right? Okay, the second one, monetary, let's see, this one right here, hold on. This one, monetary, that's the one that has to do with inflation, because this was the problem. Many Latin American countries had to start printing money, and that produced what some economists characterize as a hyperinflationary period. This was crazy, and this is the time when I was a little boy in Mexico, so I do remember scarcity and high prices. My mom, my dad struggling to find milk, to find bread. It was a tough period. Just to give you an idea, Bolivia and Brazil, especially Bolivia, but Brazil as well, and Mexico at some extent, they register inflation rates over 10,000% per year. 10,000% per year. I don't know if you can imagine that, but there are many stories of like this. If you go out for coffee to a restaurant, it was recommended to pay in advance, because if you wait until you finish your coffee, like an hour or a couple of hours later, the price would be higher. That was the speed at which the prices were going up. In fact, in these restaurants, the menus had all the items printed, but no prices. So think about going to a restaurant, getting the menu, but there is no price attached to it, because nobody wanted to stick to a price that couldn't be, guaranteed. In other cases, inflation was so high that there was stories like this. Think about, you have to carry so much money because the purchasing power of the money was so low. You will have to pay 10,000 pesos for a loaf of bread or a gallon of milk. So if you go to the grocery store, you have to carry a huge amount of money, bills and coins. So there was this story of a lady that was carrying her money on a dolly, going to the store, gets distracted, looking at the aisle for a meal, whatever. And then there's this thief that grabs the dolly, dumps the money to the floor, and runs away with the dolly, leaving the money on the floor. Like crazy, right? So it was more valuable to keep assets than money, because the money was losing purchasing power very quickly. So think about this. If you have $100 in your pocket, but the inflation rate is, $10,000%, you don't want to keep your $100 in your pocket. You want to spend it as soon as possible. Because if you wait 2-3 weeks, your $100 are not going to buy what used to be able to buy before 2 or 3 weeks. So anyway, this creates this spiraling up of prices, because the more people spend more money, the demand for these goods and services goes up, and then the prices go higher and higher and higher and higher. So once you get to that spiraling up, keeping inflation under control is very, very difficult, right? Anyway, that's the type of inflation I'm talking about. So the IMF and the World Bank said, you guys, your countries are in a huge mess. Fiscal deficits, over-regulation, inflation totally out of control, overvalued exchange rates, super protective environment. All of this needs to go away, right? And they said, we can help you. We can give you additional resources that you clearly need, but in exchange, you have to meet these conditions, right? So this is, once again, the idea of conditionality. And here, I'm listing 5 for now. I am going to expand this later. But the basic idea was, okay, guys, you need to decrease spending on public works. Basically, you need to reduce spending on things that are important, like infrastructure, education, hospitals, all of these things. You don't have the money, guys. You need to cut this. You need to privatize state-owned enterprises. You need to eliminate subsidies on goods and services. And that produces a huge amount of angst among the population because, milk used to be subsidized, gasoline used to be subsidized, transportation used to be subsidized. And then when the IMF said you cannot support these subsidies, you need to eliminate them, the prices of all this milk, education, and all of these things, they go higher even more rapidly, and that fuels more inflation. Then, of course, the monetary policy that I explained, you need to keep your inflation under control. Stop printing money. You cannot print more local currency anymore, because if you do that, you are never going to be able to keep inflation under control, right? Devaluate your currency, and this is a big one. Liberalization of markets. You need to liberalize financial markets, goods and services market, labor markets, right? So you need to reduce the power of unions, elimination of minimum wage, all of these things that, in the mind of IMF and World Bank officers were making things more difficult. And of course, you need to eliminate all these tariffs and quotas. So get rid of all these protective bubble. Remember, we talk about this protective bubble, protecting domestic industries. Now, you need to let these domestic industries compete in international markets. Otherwise, they are never going to grow, right? Anyway, so what happened? Well, the IMF, World Bank conditionality didn't work very well, especially at first. International rates didn't go down. Many of the prices of commodities produced by Latin America start going down or going very unstable. And the IMF and the World Bank were very heavily criticized by this so-called cookie cutter approach. So IMF and World Bank officers, when asking for these conditions for the release of this additional funding, they didn't pay much attention to the particular characteristics of the situation of each country. So they were asking exactly the same thing from Mexico as they were from Nicaragua. And you know, when you compare these two countries, are very different in size, very different in natural resource allocation. The population is different, and the same with Brazil and Argentina. They said, no, we are going to treat all of them equally. So this is the whole notion of this cookie cutter approach. So this recipe, the conditionality recipe, again, privatization, devaluation, liberalization, all of these things that I read before were the same in every country. And of course, in principle, this seems logical because you have to keep you have to correct the economic mistakes, but they were not fine-tuning. They were not calibrating the ask to the particular needs of this country. So things were not going well. So we're talking about 1982, 1983, 94, 90, all of these years, things were in a very difficult situation. In fact, let me show you this. Let me first get rid of this box right here. The 1980s, guys, is a very famous episode in economic history, and this is well known by pretty much anybody in economics that cares about development and international finance as well. It's well known as the lost decade. 10 years wasted, 10 years lost, totally and completely lost in Latin America. What do I mean by that? Well, you can read this table carefully later, but essentially think about this. GDP per capita, the size of the economy per capita fell. It didn't just remain stagnant. It fell more than 10% between 1981 and 1990. So think about this. In 10 years, instead of getting better, you get worse, which is like crazy, right? Can you imagine a sustained decline in economic prosperity? Or actually, you can think of this as a worsening of the economic conditions for 10 years. Well, that's the Mexico I grew up. Right, so it was a tough situation. Inflation was rampant, and unfortunately, these 10 years, many people argue, were necessary to make dramatic corrections in the path that Latin America put herself on or into. Right, so. In addition to all of these, inflation, GDP per capita falling, well, look at this. Real wages, let me draw a line here. Real wages going down. I don't know if you can see this red line. Let me do this again with a thicker. Let me move this up. And then let me draw a thicker line here. Actually, I can do this, well, whatever, right here. Real wages were going down. The bars are representing unemployment rates were going down. Were going up. And this is the 80s, right? This is, remember, we're talking about the 80s. So in addition to that, let me clear this. In addition to that, look what was happening to poverty and income inequality in Latin America. And again, I am talking about the 1980s, right? So I'm talking about from 1980 all the way to, well, say the 1990s, right? So income inequality is going up, poverty rates are going up. The Gini coefficient right here is just a measure of income inequality. Don't worry, I am not going to explain what the Gini coefficient is at this point. It's just an indicator that basically tells you that the higher the number, the higher the worse the the income distribution is. So, and of course, poverty is the percentage of the population that falls between the poverty threshold. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make here, guys, is that things were, really, really bad during this 10-year period because you had huge inflation, huge unemployment rate, increasing poverty rates, increasing, or worsening of the income distribution in the population. And of course, all of this is producing a lot of, social angst and fear and instability and fractures in the social fabric of Latin America, right? So it was a well, again, we all survive, or most of us survive. I did survive, and we can think of this as with more analytic minds and all that. But living through this time, I'm sure for my dad and my mom was pretty painful. And of course, many people in Latin America suffer the same thing. Friends, relatives in other countries experience something very, very similar. Let's see. Let me go back here. Now, this is something very important that is relevant in this context for two reasons. So reason number one, well, let me explain first what I'm talking about, right? This is the overlapping with the political economy part of the class. During this time of period, many Latin American countries that had been under military rule before dependency theory start thinking in a nostalgic way these times or those times during the military rulings, because those times were stable. They were not, characterized by prosperity, not huge economic growth, not a lot of opportunities, not a lot of freedom. But in the minds of many people in Latin America in the 1980s, at least those times were stable. They didn't have inflation, or high inflation. They didn't have high unemployment rates. The poverty rates were not as bad. So this was very important because many democratic regimes that were still a bit frail at the time start, idealizing the stability and prosperity of the military rule, right? So this is very interesting, guys, because sometimes when things are getting really, really tough for you, for your family, for your communities, I'm talking about serious matters like hunger and, debt and serious matters. Many people don't pay too much attention to the ideology, to the philosophical approaches to fiscal or monetary policy. They just are asking for the opportunity to survive, well, to make it, really. So think about this, because the other element I want to highlight is something that I am going to discuss next class more extensively, but I want to mention it here, is that all of this is happening in Latin America in the 1980s, except for one country, right? Now, I really want to actually, let me stop sharing this. With the exception of Chile, every other Latin American country was going through this major disruption during the 80s. Now, the case of Chile is very, very important, guys, because don't forget, by the way, to look at video number 1. You can find this video number 1 on the readings under dependency theory. It's like a 5-minute, 6-minute video that talks about dependency theory. But at the very end of that video speaks about Chile. Chile is an important case because everything that happened in Latin America in the 1980s had already happened in Chile 10 years earlier, right? So this is the story, and this is the story, and I really want you to pay attention to this because the case, the Chilean case, is very important for policy makers, policy, and even these philosophical approaches to economics and political economy, right? So this is the story. In 1973, Salvador Allende had been elected president of Chile by democratic means. But Salvador Allende had a very heterodox, leftist, extreme agenda, right? And the US, as a matter of foreign policy, and we are going to start talking about this, more frequently, didn't like this because they thought, now remember, the 1960s, the 1970s is the middle of the Cold War with the Soviets. So they didn't like Cuba, and that's why they put the embargo. And then you had Salvador Allende pretty much taking over Chile, which was, Latin America, inland, not an island in the Caribbean. I mean, of course, it's way too far in the south. But anyway, the US saw this as a threat, right? So now we know because, declassify CIA information. And I am going to give you a link later so that you can go to the archive where you can actually search for all these documents. Now that we have access to all this information, we know that with the assistance of the CIA on September the 11th, 1973, there was a major military coup d'etat in Chile. And basically, there are images of planes, military Chilean planes bombarding, dropping bombs in, the equivalent of the White House in Chile, which is called Casa de Moneda. And then essentially Salvador Allende is taken, and there is some controversy about whether he took his own life or was assassinated. But anyway, he was killed. He was dead. And the military coup produced that the president of Chile became a very famous guy by the name of Pinochet, Augusto Pinochet, a military general that had no idea about how to organize the economy. I'm talking about 1973, right? So he thought that the economy should obey military ruling, by decree. This is the price. By decree, this is the tax. By decree, the economy doesn't work that way. Especially a market economy doesn't work that way. So anyway, Chile was becoming a mess. Now remember, this is 10 years earlier, right? Until we have the intervention of a very famous group in economics called the Chicago Boys. This is coming from the Chicago School of Economics. In fact, Milton Friedman, the very famous economist, traveled to Chile to assist the Chicago Boys and to assist the Chilean government under the military rule of Augusto Pinochet. And of course, this was a very painful period in Chile because, well, the level of censorship, the limitation of freedom took extreme proportions. A lot of people disappeared. A lot of people were tortured and killed under this brutal dictatorship by Augusto Pinochet. But anyway, the Chicago Boys went to Chile and they said, okay, the solution is clear, guys. You need to reduce the size of the government. You need to devaluate your currency. You need to liberalize your labor markets, financial markets. Hey, does that sound familiar? Exactly. It's the same recipe, exactly the same recipe that 10 years later, the IMF and the World Bank were imposing every other Latin American country as a condition for the release of the funds. But the Chicago Boys basically take over the management of the economy in Chile in 1973, and they start implementing all these measurements 10 years before. Now, this is very interesting, guys, because in Chile, even if you go to today, there is this strange feeling because people in Chile associate market economics and market economics-based policies like privatization, liberalization, deregulation with a painful period, with something that is costly, something that requires dictators, something that diminishes democracy, something that gives less freedom to choose, freedom to live. So many people in Chile, and things are changing because we were talking about almost 3 generations after, but 20 years ago, when 10 years ago when I went over to Santiago de Chile, I remember talking to some people saying, "Hey, man, these were really difficult times because they were selling this package based on markets, free markets." But at the same time, we were oppressed politically by the military dictatorship, right? And actually, I'm going to find the video and I'm going to post it. But there is a very famous situation happening when Milton Friedman said, don't worry. Again, Milton Friedman is one of the most influential economists in the world. He said, actually, he won the Nobel Prize in economics. He said, well, the power of the markets is so important and so large that can bring freedom to the political world. So from the economy, if you have a free market economy, this free market economy is going to force a transition from a dictatorship towards a more democratic environment. Milton Friedman died before he could see that, but in the end, I guess he was right because eventually the military coup was ended. Instead, now in Chile we have democratic governments and we have elections, and although the military is still pretty powerful, because Pinochet made sure that give a very large amount of the revenue from copper. In case you don't know, Chile is the second, maybe the first, the largest, second largest producer of copper in the world. So the military in Chile have direct access to this revenue. And in fact, the Chilean military is fear in South America, because they actually have nuclear submarines and pretty powerful planes and helicopters. Anyway, but they are not in charge anymore. Now we have a democratic government. But anyway, the point I was trying to make is that you really need to understand that Chile is a big exception to Latin America, because everything happened 10 years earlier in Chile than the rest of the world, than the rest of the Latin American world. You know, we are going to continue this conversation, making some contrast and some comparisons between what happened in Chile and the rest of Latin America. But in general, the recipe was the same. All right, guys, I think I'm gonna stop now, and I am going to continue with this conversation on Monday live. So I hope to see you guys there. And once again, don't forget to read. You have a lot of things to read. And if you have questions, comments, stop by during office hours, send me emails, whatever you need to do. Just keep up. There is no homework. There is not much to do, which is different from other classes. So I'm relying on your responsibility as grown-ups to keep track of what's happening. All right. I'm going to stop recording now. Thanks.